I'm Jason Wells. I'm 38 years old, a former U.S. Army captain. Most people see me now chopping wood outside a cabin I built with my own hands, smiling at my son riding his bike down the gravel path, and think I've got the American dream locked in. But what they don't see is what I carry every day, quietly tucked behind the bones of my smile. I came back from my third tour with all my limbs intact, but not all my brothers did. The ones who didn't make it home, they haunt me. I don't mean that in a poetic way. I see their faces when I close my eyes at night. I hear the silence that followed their last breath every time the world around me gets too quiet. Survivor's guilt isn't a ghost that fades. It's a weight you get used to carrying, like body armor you never take off. That's why I built this place. I poured every piece of myself into this cabin in Colorado, every nail, every plank, every mistake and correction. I told myself it was for my family, but deep down, I knew I needed to build something solid, something good, as if laying down this foundation might settle the shifting ground inside me. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I could create peace out here, it might drown out the war that kept echoing inside me. Amanda, my wife, is a middle school art teacher. Soft-spoken, quick to smile, the kind of woman who reads old poetry books and believes in the power of kindness. We met right after I got out. I fell fast. We had Oliver a year later, and for a while, it felt like I'd done it. I'd stitched together a life worth living. Our days were simple mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings chasing fireflies with our boy. It looked perfect, and honestly, I tried to believe it was. But here's the thing about building something with your own hands. You know where the weak spots are. You know which boards didn't quite fit, which nails you bent and hammered in anyway. I felt it, in my gut, even before everything started unraveling. That something wasn't quite right. That maybe peace wasn't something you could hammer into place. And as much as I tried to ignore it, there were shadows creeping in through the cracks. Shadows that led me right back to the one man I thought I had finally left behind, my father. It was a gray morning when we buried my father. The kind of sky that hangs low and presses down on your shoulders like an invisible weight. He was a retired Army colonel, the kind of man who could command a room with a glance and leave it colder than when he walked in. The funeral was small. Just a handful of people who knew him from the old days, most of them in stiff suits and medals they hadn't polished in years. My mother stood beside me, dry-eyed, steady. That was how she'd always been with him, still and unreadable. Like she knew something the rest of us never would. I hadn't spoken to my father much over the past decade. Our last real conversation had ended with him saying, "The world is a lie, son. Don't get comfortable in peace." That line stuck with me. It always had. At the time, I thought it was just his way of being cold. He was never much for softness, especially not with me. But standing there, with the flag folded in my arms and the sound of dirt hitting the casket, that sentence came back sharp as ever. And it didn't feel like cynicism anymore. It felt like a warning. After the service, his lawyer handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a single sentence, written in his all-caps block handwriting. "Check the bunker. Trust yourself." My first instinct was to laugh. Of course the old man had a bunker. That was so like him. But what got me wasn't the instruction. It was the part that said trust yourself. He'd never told me that before, not once. The next day, I hiked out to the old property deep in the woods. The cabin he lived in after retirement was more fortress than home. No electricity, no cell reception, no visitors. I found the hatch exactly where I remembered it from when I was a kid, hidden beneath a fake stone slab behind the woodshed. The keypad still worked. I typed in his birth year and the door clicked open. The air inside was cold and stale, like the place hadn't been touched in years, but it was spotless. Organized. It looked like a private intelligence cell. Metal shelves lined with binders, digital backups labeled by date, wall maps dotted with colored pins. A row of screens, disconnected but still humming faintly. At the center of it all was a workbench covered in folders, all of them marked with Amanda's name. My hands shook as I opened the first one. Inside were surveillance photos. Amanda at the grocery store. Amanda at Oliver's school. Amanda meeting someone I didn't recognize in a parking garage at night. I flipped through timestamps, receipts, GPS data. Every step she'd taken over the last 5 years documented, cataloged, analyzed. There were notes too. Behavioral patterns, voice inflections, hand gestures cross-referenced with what looked like espionage handbooks. My father had spent the last stretch of his life not preparing for death, but preparing to expose something. I wanted to believe it was paranoia, that he'd gone senile. But he hadn't lost a step. Every page was methodical, thought out, strategic. It wasn't suspicion, it was conviction. He had believed no, he had known something was wrong. I don't remember how long I stayed down there. Hours, maybe. By the time I emerged, the sun had dipped below the tree line and the woods were quiet in that eerie way they get when night is about to settle. I closed the hatch and started walking back to my truck. That's when I saw it. A dark SUV parked just beyond the tree line, where the road curves out of sight. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to know it hadn't been there when I arrived. When I turned to get a better look, it was gone. That was the moment the weight in my gut changed. It wasn't grief anymore. It was dread, the kind that wraps around your spine and tightens slow. My life had stopped being about building peace. Now I was digging up a war I hadn't even realized I was still in. I sat down at the old monitor and pushed play on the first video. The footage was grainy but clear enough to make my stomach turn. Amanda was sitting at a cafe on the west side of town, a place we used to go on Sundays after church. Across from her was a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't touching her. No intimate glances, no lingering hands. It wasn't a date. It looked like a meeting. They didn't smile much. Their body language was tight, professional. Amanda passed him a folded envelope under the table, quick, like she was swatting a fly. He didn't open it. Just slipped it into his coat pocket and nodded. A handler. That word landed in my chest like a brick. I didn't want to think it, but I couldn't unsee it. This wasn't an affair. It was something else. Something colder. I moved on to the next clip. Different location. Same guy. This time it was a park. Amanda sat on a bench feeding birds. The man approached from behind, paused, said something low. She barely turned her head. Their lips barely moved. I would have missed it if I hadn't replayed it 5 times. My father had annotated it with timestamps, weather conditions, suspected code phrases. He'd tracked their patterns, even cross-referenced the timestamps with Amanda's calendar and text messages. There were folders too. Copies of hotel bookings in cities Amanda claimed were for education conferences. But there was no record of the events she said she was attending. Flight itineraries that didn't match what she'd told me. Email chains between burner accounts. None of them explicitly incriminating, but all of them off. Just enough to feel staged. Just enough to feel like something was being orchestrated beneath the surface. One image stuck with me. Amanda leaving a federal building at night. She was alone, but the timestamp matched the same day she told me she was chaperoning a school art fair. That night, Oliver had come home with a participation ribbon and glitter in his hair. And there she was, in heels and a black coat, walking out of a place with no sign on the door. My chest tightened with a nausea I hadn't felt since deployment. The further I dug, the worse it got. It was like peeling back wallpaper and finding mold across the whole foundation. What scared me wasn't just what she'd done. It was how much of it had been right in front of me. Smiles over dinner, birthday cards, movie nights. And all the while, she was playing another role entirely. My wife, my son's mother, or maybe just an asset with a target. And the target was me. The notebooks were worn, leather-bound, and organized with a precision that only made me feel worse. Each one covered about 6 months of my father's life, 5 years in total. 5 years spent documenting Amanda, tracking her movements, comparing her statements with surveillance, timing her calls, cataloging her lies. It wasn't just a man's hunch. It was a full-blown intelligence operation, mapped out in quiet rage and military discipline. There were diagrams connecting names I didn't know, pages cross-referencing dates, receipts, metadata from audio files he'd recovered off her old devices. He'd even written probability assessments, just like we used in recon analysis. One note read, "Confirmed contact with known operative. Behavioral alignment consistent with asset grooming." That word asset hit me like a punch to the gut. To him, she wasn't my wife. She was a tool, a placement, a planted piece in a wider game. I kept flipping pages, hoping for doubt, for hesitation, anything to suggest he wasn't certain, but it was all so measured. No rage, no scattered thoughts, just lines of logic, patterns, consistency. He had seen this play out before, probably in places he couldn't talk about. He knew how covert placement worked. He recognized the rhythm, the camouflage, and he'd seen it in Amanda. I wanted to scream, to tear the pages apart and shove them back in their dusty boxes. Because none of it lined up with the woman I loved, the woman who nursed our son through fevers, the woman who rubbed my back when the nightmares came. But love has blind spots, and now they were being lit up with harsh, undeniable light. I sat there, elbows on the cold table, surrounded by a lifetime of secrets my father died carrying. I remembered how we used to fight, how I once called him paranoid, bitter, incapable of trust. And now here I was, gripping his notes like a drowning man holds a life raft. The truth wasn't just creeping in, it was crashing through the walls. And I didn't know who I was more afraid of, Amanda, for deceiving me, or myself for needing so badly to believe she never could. My mother was in the kitchen when I came back from the bunker. She was chopping carrots like it was any other day, but her hands moved slower when she saw my face. I didn't ask. I just dropped the folder of surveillance photos on the table between us. Her eyes flicked down, then back up to mine, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her expression. Not surprise, not confusion, just a tired kind of fear. The kind that comes from carrying a secret too long. I asked her if she knew. She nodded once, sat down, and folded her hands like she was back in church. She told me there were things she had never been allowed to say, things she had buried before I was even born. When she was young, long before meeting my father, she had been part of something called simply the program. She didn't know its full name, but it was a network, political, military, intelligence, shadow operations. Her role had been small, mostly data access, nothing violent. But over time, she said, the work became darker. She was told who to follow, who to manipulate, who to forget. That was when she met my father. He saw through it almost immediately. Said she spoke like someone always measuring her words. Said her eyes scanned every room like she was counting exits. He didn't judge her. He protected her, got her out, changed their identities, moved across the country, and they agreed never to speak of it again, until Amanda came into the picture. She paused then, looked straight at me, said she hadn't known for sure, but she recognized the signals. The long disappearances, the emotionally flat responses during stress, the way Amanda always kept just enough distance. She told my father it was happening again, that the program was still alive. Only now, it had a new name, the reset. She didn't believe his death was natural. She had seen the signs before. Subtle pressure on the chest, neurological misfires, sudden strokes with no warning. All symptoms of certain biochemical agents developed decades ago. My father had been digging too deep, and she believed they silenced him before he could surface with the truth. I didn't speak for a long time. I just sat there, listening to the clock tick over the silence. My world had already been shaking, but this was the final crack that split it wide open. My father had spent his final years trying to expose something I didn't even know existed. My wife was part of it, and now, my mother was trusting me to carry on the one thing he couldn't finish. This wasn't just about my marriage anymore, or even about my son. This was about taking back a truth that had been stolen long before I ever knew it existed. My father died trying to protect me from it. I wasn't going to let that be in vain. It happened fast. One day I was driving Oliver to school and packing his lunches, and the next I was sitting in a courtroom being told I couldn't see my son. Amanda stood across the room, calm and measured, as her lawyer laid out a case built from pieces of my past. They talked about the night terrors, the medication I'd stopped taking, the time I'd woken up yelling from a dream and accidentally knocked a glass off the counter, things I had shared with her in trust, things I had worked through for years. Now they were being used like bullets against me. She painted a picture of a man on the edge, said Oliver had become fearful around me, showed texts I'd sent late at night when I couldn't sleep, rambling and incoherent, taken out of context. It didn't matter that I'd never laid a hand on my boy. The suggestion was enough. The court ruled for temporary custody in Amanda's favor. Supervised visitation, mandatory evaluation. I watched my son cry as he was pulled from my arms, and I couldn't do a thing to stop it. That night, I sat in my truck outside the house I built with my bare hands, watching the lights turn off one by one. My chest felt hollow. All the years I'd spent clawing my way back to normal after combat, rebuilding a life, a family, were now being rewritten into a story I didn't recognize. She hadn't just taken my son. She had taken my truth and twisted it into something ugly, something believable. I stayed in that truck until sunrise. Then I drove to a cabin in the hills that had once been part of a training site, now long forgotten. Inside was a SATCOM unit I'd buried in a weatherproof case years ago, just in case. I powered it up, bypassed the commercial lines, and accessed an encrypted military comm protocol only a handful of us ever used. I sent a single message to a man I hadn't spoken to in 7 years. He was with the Bureau now. I attached scans of the bunker files, timelines, photographs, everything my father had tracked. No explanations, just a subject line: need eyes, need backup. I didn't know if he'd respond, but I knew one thing. Amanda had drawn first blood, and she'd used the one thing she could never understand, my scars, as her weapon. She thought that would break me, but she forgot. I've been broken before, and I came back stronger every time. The response came 3 days later. A secure channel lit up with a coded reply, one I hadn't seen since my last Black Ops deployment. It was short, direct, and laced with urgency. My contact had taken the file straight to internal affairs at the Bureau. Within hours, the data had triggered red-level interest across multiple agencies. My father hadn't just uncovered suspicions. He had traced a living network, one hiding in plain sight. The reset wasn't theory anymore. It was a sanctioned protocol buried under layers of shell corporations and off-book contracts. Designed after the war, its mission was to identify and neutralize veterans deemed a threat to long-term national restructuring. Soldiers with high-clearance backgrounds, combat leadership, and strong moral resistance. The kind of men and women who might one day stand up and say no when the system pushed too far. Amanda hadn't just married me, she had studied me. Reported on my routines, my triggers, my vulnerabilities. Every moment we shared had been part of her assignment. They called her an infiltrator class asset, embedded for long-term psychological profiling. My home had been her operation site. My life, her cover. The evidence I provided wasn't just compelling. It was damning. It mapped contacts across 3 states and linked internal funds to backdoor intelligence streams. My old buddy told me quietly that I'd just blown the lid off something bigger than either of us imagined. They moved fast after that. Discreet extractions, sealed warrants, hush orders. Amanda vanished. Her entire alias collapsed under scrutiny. They confirmed she wasn't even her real name. In the official report, they credited the exposure to classified intel obtained by a former Army captain operating in private civilian capacity. But everyone in that room knew it was more than that. I didn't just survive what they threw at me. I dismantled it, piece by piece. The reset had spent years turning warriors into liabilities. But this time, one of us fought back. Not with guns. Not with rage, but with proof, with discipline, with purpose. They tried to erase me. Instead, I carved my name into their secret history, and I wasn't done yet. 1 year later, the court gave me back full custody. It didn't come with a speech or apology. Just a signature, a nod, and a paper that said I could take my son home. But I didn't need the ceremony. I just needed his hand in mine again, solid and warm, like it used to be. We packed our lives into the back of an old pickup and drove north, past the town limits, past the pain. The cabin had changed, not in how it looked, but in what it meant. It used to be a place of shadows. Now it was a place of light. I rebuilt the porch, took down the old antennas, kept the inside simple, just enough for two people to be comfortable and free. We painted the walls white, let the birds nest in the eaves. And every morning, I made breakfast while Oliver scribbled comic strips on the kitchen table. Today was warm, with the kind of breeze that carries the smell of pine. We sat outside, each with a brush in hand, dabbing color onto a long scrap of canvas. He wanted to draw a dragon. I added a knight. He told me mine looked more like a soldier. I told him that's probably all I know how to draw. He smiled at that. Then he went quiet. After a while, he looked up and asked if we could stay here forever. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him, his hair a mess of sunshine, his eyes tired in that way kids get when they feel safe. I told him we'd stay as long as he wanted. No more running, no more hiding. As he went back to his painting, I looked out over the trees, the mountains beyond, the trail my father used to walk. I thought about everything we'd lost and everything we got back. Then I leaned back in the chair, closed my eyes for a second, and whispered something I didn't even know I'd been holding on to. Mission complete, Dad.